Pittsburgh in October looks like a city that has given up on color. The rivers run dark, the bridges connect gray to gray, and somewhere on the 11th floor of a glass tower downtown, a man is staring at a spreadsheet that has his name on none of it. He has 142 in his bank account. He has 8 days. He has a daughter with a fever spiking past 102 in a nurse's office 4 miles away. And he has a manager blocking the aisle. The fluorescent lights don't stop humming. The numbers on the screen don't stop blurring. The phone in his pocket is the only thing in the room that's telling him the truth. He grabs his jacket. He grabs one photograph. He does not log out. 2 days later, a black town car pulls into a crumbling parking lot across the city. The woman who steps out does not belong in this zip code. She knocks anyway. He didn't plan to throw his career away on a Tuesday. But here's the thing about plans. They assume the world will hold still long enough for you to execute them. They assume the fluorescent lights will keep humming at the same frequency. They assume the spreadsheet will wait. They assume a 7-year-old's immune system will cooperate with your Q3 deadline. Ryan Robinson had been a senior data analyst at Clark Data Systems for 4 years, 3 months, and approximately 11 days too long. He knew this the way you know a pair of shoes has finally died, not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of mornings where putting them on felt less like routine and more like punishment. He sat at his desk on the 11th floor of a glass tower in downtown Pittsburgh and stared at the numbers until the numbers stopped meaning anything at all. Outside, October was doing what October did in Pittsburgh. Gray sky pressing down on gray buildings. Rain that couldn't commit to being rain. Just a permanent mist that made everything look like it had given up. The Monongahela somewhere below, dark and patient. Ryan had stopped noticing the view about 6 weeks into the job. Now he just noticed the reflection of the overhead lights in the glass. The way they buzzed. The way they never, ever stopped. His desk was in the middle of the open-plan floor. No walls. No door to close. Would you treat them with kindness? Just a low cubicle partition that came up to about chest height if you were standing, which meant you were never truly alone and never truly with anyone either. The ergonomic chair had been adjusted by 3 different occupants before him and now existed in a configuration that was uncomfortable for every possible human spine. He'd filed a request for a new one in February. It was October now. The spreadsheet on his screen contained Q3 projections for the company's Western server infrastructure. It was his model, his formula, his 4 days of methodical cross-referencing pulled from 6 different data sources. He'd built it from scratch because the previous model, the one Donald Thomas had presented to the board in August with great confidence and a laser pointer, had been wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in the way that costs companies real money. The kind of wrong that makes CFOs go quiet in meetings and then sends emails afterward with a lot of carefully chosen words. Ryan had fixed it. Quietly. Without announcement. Because that's what you did when you were a data analyst at a company that claimed to value precision but actually valued optics. You fixed the thing. You didn't make a thing about fixing the thing. You sent the corrected version to Donald as a shared file with a note that said something like updated model attached. Let me know if you have questions, and then you watched Donald present it at the next meeting as though he had built it with his own 2 hands. Ryan had watched this happen twice. He was on his 3rd coffee of the day. Would you treat them with kindness? The company coffee machine on the 11th floor dispensed something that was technically coffee in the same way that a parking lot puddle is technically water. Would you treat them with kindness? He drank it anyway because the alternative was driving 4 blocks to the good place, and that would require leaving his desk, and leaving his desk would require someone to notice he'd left his desk, and that would require a conversation he didn't have the bandwidth for today. The spreadsheet blurred slightly at the edges. He blinked, 2:14 p.m. His phone vibrated against the desk. Face down, he'd put it face down at 8 a.m. Because face up meant watching the Slack notifications pile up from Donald's various channels, each one a small erosion of his will to continue existing in a professional capacity. He flipped it over. Jefferson Elementary Nurse's Office. His stomach dropped the way it only drops for parents. Fast. Cold. Total. He answered before the second ring finished. The nurse's name was Brenda. She had a kind voice. The voice of someone who had delivered this particular kind of news to hundreds of parents and understood exactly what happened to a person's chest when they heard it. Lily's fever had spiked to 102.4. She'd thrown up twice. She was asking for her dad. She really needed to be picked up as soon as possible. "I'm on my way," Ryan said. Already saving the document. Already pushing back from the desk. He grabbed his jacket, faded corduroy, brown, one of the elbows going thin off the back of his chair, and reached for the framed photo next to his monitor. Lily, missing her 2 front teeth, grinning at the camera like she'd just gotten away with something spectacular. He took the photo, left the company-branded thermos, left the stress ball shaped like a little stress ball, didn't log out of his terminal, and turned directly into Donald Thomas. Donald Thomas was 44 years old and had the energy of a man who had once read a book about leadership and decided that was enough. He wore too much of a cologne that cost more than Ryan's grocery budget. He had leased 3 BMWs over the past 6 years, always the same model, always silver, always with the upgraded package, which Ryan knew, because Donald mentioned it with the frequency of a man who needed you to know this about him. He considered synergy a core personality trait. He used the phrase circling back as a verb, a noun, and occasionally as a greeting. He was also, at this particular moment, standing directly in the narrow aisle between the cubicle partitions with his arms loosely crossed, and a look on his face that said he had been waiting. Whoa. Donald stepped back slightly, performatively. "Where are we rushing off to?" Ryan didn't slow down. "Lily's sick. I have to pick her up." Right. Donald moved with him. One of those lateral steps, mirroring, like a basketball defender who'd learned the motion without understanding the game. "Thing is, Ryan, the Q3 projections are due at 4. Richard needs that deck formatted before he boards." Ryan sidestepped left, Donald adjusted right. "Her fever's at 102. Have you tried calling someone? A sitter, maybe? Or—" Donald paused with the particular pause of a man about to say something he knows is wrong but is going to say anyway, because he needs to complete the sentence he started. "Her mother?" The aisle was narrow. The fluorescent lights were very bright. Ryan stopped walking. "Her mother died 3 years ago, Donald." He kept his voice flat. "Careful. I've told you this. Twice." Something moved across Donald's face. Not remorse exactly. More like the brief computational processing of a fact that was inconvenient to his current position. Right? Right. Look, I hear you. That's a tough situation. I genuinely move. I'm just saying, the nurse can watch her for another hour. It's literally her job. You finish the deck, you go get Lily, everyone wins." Ryan looked at him. Not with anger. With something quieter than anger. Something that had been sitting at the bottom of him for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days, and had finally reached the surface with the slow inevitability of something that was always going to get there eventually. "My daughter," Ryan said, "is 7 years old. She is lying in a room that smells like industrial cleaner. She has a fever over 102. She is asking for me, and you are standing in a doorway telling me that a spreadsheet is more important than that." Donald's jaw shifted. "I'm not saying." "Move, Donald." "Ryan." Donald's voice dropped, took on the particular register of a middle manager who has decided to invoke authority he has never quite earned. "You've been slipping. Leaving right at 5. Not responding to Slack on weekends. We need team players right now. If you walk out of here," he leaned in, just slightly. "Just enough. Don't bother coming back Wednesday." The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere across the floor, a printer was doing something labored and asthmatic. 3 desks over, Ryan could feel the particular quality of silence that meant people were pretending not to listen. He looked at Donald Thomas, at the smooth, untroubled face of a man who had never once, in his 44 years, been the only person responsible for another person's entire world. He looked past Donald at the rows of gray desks and the tired people sitting at them, trading their waking hours for a paycheck that covered rent in a city that kept costing more. He thought about Lily in a cot in a nurse's office. Lily with the red cheeks and the glassy eyes asking for her dad. "Okay," Ryan said. Donald blinked. "Okay, you'll stay?" "Okay, I'm not coming back Wednesday." He reached past Donald, not pushing, just reaching. The way you move past an obstacle that has stopped being relevant, and grabbed his keys from the desk. The framed photo was already in his other hand. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He waited. The doors opened. He got in. He didn't look back. He knew they were watching. Would you treat them with kindness? The particular weight of 20-something people trying to look like they weren't watching. He let them watch. He had Lily's photo in his hand and his keys and his jacket with the worn elbow, and that was everything that was going to matter in about 40 minutes. The elevator descended. The drive to Jefferson Elementary took 19 minutes through the kind of Pittsburgh traffic that existed specifically to remind you that the city was built on hills and rivers and the particular geography of municipal regret. The drizzle had decided to commit. Rain now. Real rain. The windshield wipers on his 2017 Honda Civic made a sound on every return stroke that he'd been meaning to look into for 3 months. He found parking half a block from the school and walked the rest of the way with his collar up against the rain. The school smelled the way all elementary schools smell, that specific combination of industrial floor cleaner and construction paper, and the faint ghost of every lunch ever served in a cafeteria. The nurse's office was at the end of the main corridor, past the art projects taped to the walls, 5th graders' self-portraits, every one of them optimistic in a way that made Ryan's chest do something complicated. Lily was on the cot in the corner, curled in a tight ball, her knees pulled up, still wearing the outfit she'd chosen herself this morning. The purple shirt with the silver star on it, and the jeans with the rainbow patch on the left knee. She had a damp paper towel pressed to her forehead, the kind of improvised comfort that children apply to themselves when they're waiting for an adult to arrive. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes, when they opened and found him in the doorway, were glassy and unfocused. Then they focused. "Daddy." Her voice came out wrong, small and scratchy and relieved in the way that only a sick child's voice can be relieved, when the person they needed most is suddenly just there. "Hey, kiddo." He crossed the room in 4 steps and sat on the edge of the cot and put his hand on her forehead. Hot. Very hot. Even through what the nurse had been doing to bring it down. "I've got you. I'm right here." She didn't say anything else. She just turned her face into his shoulder and held onto his jacket with both hands. He carried her to the car. She was too big to be carried. Technically. She would tell him this herself on regular occasions, with some irritation, when he tried to be affectionate in public. But right now she was 7 years old and sick and holding his jacket, and he carried her to the car and buckled her in and drove home through the rain. The apartment was cold when they got there. He'd forgotten to turn the heat on before he left that morning, doing the perpetual calculation of someone watching a utility bill. And now the place had that hollow chill of a space that had been empty all day. He got the heat going first. Then Lily settled on the couch with the good blanket, the big soft one with the faded pattern of green and yellow, her grandmother's, the only piece of furniture in the apartment that had come from before, and Ryan started the rotation. Cool washcloth to the forehead. Children's Tylenol measured carefully on the little dosing cup. Water in small sips, because the last time he'd given her too much water too fast, she'd thrown up again and they'd been back to square one. The thermometer every 45 minutes, the number, each time making a small tightening in his chest until it didn't. He heated up chicken soup from a can because it was what he had, and it was what she wanted, and she ate half of it, which was better than nothing. He sat with her through 2 episodes of the cartoon she liked, the one about the rabbit who was also some kind of detective, which he had seen enough times now that he knew the plots by heart. Would you treat them with kindness? And the knowledge that he could follow a cartoon rabbit's detective storylines without looking at the screen was either a sign of good parenting or complete psychological erosion, and he had stopped being sure which. By 8 o'clock her temperature had come down to 101.2. By 10 it was 100.6. She fell asleep around 9, the cartoon still going. and Ryan sat in the chair across from the couch and watched her breathe in the flickering light of the TV and let himself be relieved. Just for a minute. The relief you allow yourself when a crisis has de-escalated but not resolved. The cautious exhale of a person who knows the night isn't over yet. He turned the TV off. Got up every hour to check. 100.1 at 11, 99.8 at midnight. At 3 a.m., the thermometer read 98.9, and she was sleeping the deep, even sleep of a fever that had broken. The restless animal that had been living in Ryan's chest since 2:14 that afternoon finally went still. He went to the kitchen. The apartment was quiet. The way apartments are quiet, in the middle of the night in a city that is never entirely quiet. There was still the distant sound of a truck on the main road 2 blocks over. Still the occasional siren somewhere. Still the settling sounds of an old building, adjusting to the cold. But the kitchen was its own quiet. The overhead light was off. The street lamp outside came through the window and lay across the linoleum in a long yellow rectangle. Ryan sat on one of the stools at the kitchen island laminate countertop, peeling slightly at the near corner where moisture had gotten under it, and put his phone on the counter and looked at it. He opened the banking app. He already knew. He knew before he opened it. Would you treat them with kindness? But there is something about making yourself look at a number directly that is different from carrying it around in your head, the same way a diagnosis is different from a suspicion. And Ryan had always believed in making himself look at things directly rather than carrying them. 142. Rent was 1,800. Due in 8 days. He had walked out of a job that paid 80,000 a year, walked out, which meant voluntary resignation, which meant no severance, which meant the conversation with HR had been a series of carefully worded voicemails and a single automated email about Cobra health insurance that he had opened, read the first number of, and closed immediately. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, sat in the dark, listened to Lily breathe from the other room. He had chosen his daughter. He would choose her again. Every time, without hesitation, he would choose her. This was not the question. This had never been the question. The question was what came next. There was no partner to call. Would you treat them with kindness? There was no one to sit across from in this kitchen and say we'll figure it out together, because Ellen had been gone for 3 years and the kitchen still had small pieces of her in it, the green bowl on the second shelf she'd found at a market downtown. The crack in the window, kindness. The crack meaning to report to the landlord and then never did, and Ryan had gotten very good at being alone in this kitchen at 3 a.m. But he had not yet gotten used to it, and he suspected he never entirely would. He opened his laptop. He told himself he was going to look at job boards. That was what made sense at 3 a.m. with 142 in his account. Practical steps. Responsible next actions. He looked at job boards for approximately 7 minutes. Every listing was a carbon copy of the thing he'd just left. Fast-paced environment. Team player. Flexible hours. The language of a job market that had decided employee well-being was a line item you could trim. He recognized the code in every bullet point because he had lived inside the code for 4 years. Comfortable with ambiguity meant the leadership had no idea what they were doing but would be very confident about it. Entrepreneurial mindset meant they had startup energy and publicly traded expectations with no corresponding equity. Passionate about the mission meant the salary was going to be insulting, and they were hoping enthusiasm would cover the gap. He closed the job board. He sat in the yellow light from the window. He thought about Donald Thomas's face when Ryan had said okay, the way the word had landed. The brief flicker of something not guilt. Donald didn't do guilt, but something adjacent to surprise. The look of a man who had issued an ultimatum and genuinely not expected the other person to call it. He thought about the Q3 model on his computer. His model. His 4 days. Donald would present it. That was already decided. Donald would stand in front of a slide with Ryan's numbers and Ryan's formula and Ryan's careful cross-referencing, and he would use that laser pointer, and he would take the credit with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had been doing exactly that for 18 months. And Ryan would not be there, and no one would say a word, because that's how it worked. That's how it had always worked. You built the thing. Someone else named the thing, and if you complained about this, if you raised your hand in a meeting and said, "Actually, I built this," you became the problem. You became the one who wasn't a team player, who didn't understand how things worked, who was, in the particular vocabulary of a corporate culture that ran on politeness as a weapon, difficult. Ryan opened a new email window. He was going to write to HR. That was what you did. You wrote to HR. You used measured language. You described the situation in neutral terms. You asked for a callback. That was what he was going to do. What he actually did was start typing. It came out fast, faster than he expected. The kind of writing with kindness. The kind of writing that happens when something has been compressed for a long time and suddenly finds the exit. He wrote about Donald Thomas and the aisle between the cubicles. He wrote about the Q2 model and the metadata and the 18 months of credit that had flowed in the wrong direction. He wrote about the exit interview surveys that everyone filled out with careful, legally vetted kindness. Legally vetted language because they knew the surveys went to HR, and then HR reported to leadership, and saying the actual truth in a survey at a company where you worked was like writing your complaints on a postcard addressed to the person you were complaining about. Would you treat them with kindness? He wrote about the culture of performative presence, the way the office rewarded visibility over output, the way managers who burned through people were protected by the numbers those burned people produced before they left. He wrote about what it cost to recruit and train a senior developer. He knew the number, 112,000. He'd seen it in the aggregate HR data. He'd been asked to run an analysis on 8 months ago, and he wrote about the mathematical stupidity of a system that was hemorrhaging institutional knowledge while congratulating itself on its efficiency. He quoted Donald Thomas directly. Exact words. The mother comment. The nurse can watch her comment. The don't bother coming back comment. He typed for 40 minutes. The email was 1,400 words. When he was finished, he sat back and read it, and it was hostile and specific, and it bypassed every established protocol for internal communication, and it was absolutely, unambiguously the wrong way to do this. He looked at the recipient field. He had started typing the HR intake email address, but somewhere in the 40 minutes of typing he had also, without quite making the decision consciously, added names. Senior leadership, the VP of operations, the chief people officer, the CFO, and at the top of the list, because it was alphabetical, and because her name started with C. Laura Clark, CEO, founder. He sat with his finger over the trackpad for a long moment. Then he pressed send. He closed the laptop, put his head down on the counter, stayed there for about 30 seconds. Then he sat up, rinsed his coffee cup, checked on Lily one more time. Still 98.9, still the deep even sleep. Her hair stuck slightly to her cheek, and went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought about what he had done, and felt the particular sensation of a person who has jumped from a high place, and is no longer going up and not yet going down, and for one strange suspended second is neither. He fell asleep before the sensation resolved. Morning came the way. Mornings come when you've been awake most of the night managing a crisis too bright, too soon, with a quality of light that felt accusatory. Ryan was up at 7 because Lily was up at 7, padding into the kitchen in her socks and the oversized shirt she'd slept in, hair in the particular configuration that only sleep can produce, and she said she was hungry, and her forehead was cool to the touch, and her eyes were clear. Would you treat them with kindness? He made her toast with butter and a small glass of orange juice, which she drank slowly and carefully the way she did when she was still a little uncertain about her stomach, and then she went to the living room and sat on the rug and started building something out of plastic blocks. And the normalcy of this, the very ordinary Tuesday morning normalcy of a 7-year-old building a block structure, was so complete that Ryan stood in the kitchen watching her for a moment before he remembered what he had done at 3 a.m. He opened his laptop. The email had been delivered. Of course it had. The little check marks that indicated delivery, sitting there without remorse. He opened his sent folder and read the email again in the morning light. It was exactly as hostile as he remembered. It was also, he had to acknowledge, accurate. Every number was correct. Every quote was exact. He had not exaggerated a single thing. which did not make it less of a career-ending document. HR called at 9:15. He let it go to voicemail. Would you treat them with kindness? They left a message that was 20 seconds of careful language about next steps and the importance of following established communication channels and a discussion of your employment status at your earliest convenience. All of it clearly written by someone whose job was to say nothing in the most official possible way. A second voicemail at 10:30 from the same person, same language, same carefully constructed blankness. Then an automated email, confirmation of voluntary resignation. Cobra health insurance options and their associated costs. The costs were what he'd expected, which was to say, impossible. He hit refresh on his inbox after that. Nothing. No one from leadership had responded to his email. Not the VP of operations. Not the chief people officer. Not the CFO. He had sent 1,400 words of carefully documented institutional failure to 6 senior executives and received, in return, the professional equivalent of absolute silence. He closed the email, opened a job board, read 3 listings, closed the job board. Lily was building something complex now. A multi-level structure involving 2 different block systems that weren't technically compatible, but that she had decided should work together anyway. And she was narrating quietly to herself as she built. Would you treat them with kindness? A running commentary on the architectural decisions she was making and the narrative reasons behind them. Something about a fortress and the creatures who lived in the East Wing. Daddy, she said, without looking up, do we have any of the purple triangles? Check the bag under the couch. She checked. She found them. She held one up in triumph. Ryan watched her and felt the thing he always felt when he watched her, that particular compound emotion that had no good English word for it. Something between love and grief and gratitude and a fierce, almost frightening protectiveness. And then his phone vibrated on the counter and he picked it up. Unknown number. Pittsburgh area code, he answered. Silence for a moment. Then Mr. Robinson, a woman's voice, low. A slight roughness to it, like good timber. The kind of voice that carried itself differently than most voices, not louder, just more present, taking up the space it occupied without apology, speaking. I'm downstairs. He blinked. I'm sorry? I'm downstairs. In your lobby. A pause. Well, in front of your building. Your lobby doesn't appear to have a buzzer that functions. Ryan looked at the front door of his apartment as though it had just become a different object. Who is this? Laura Clark. He stood very still for 3 full seconds. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer it directly. All right. Am I being sued? A pause. Would you treat them with kindness? Then, something that might have been the very beginning of something that wasn't quite a smile, held in check by what was clearly extensive practice. No. Okay. He exhaled. Okay. Can I ask? You can ask me when you let me in. It's October, Mr. Robinson, and it's raining. He walked to the intercom. Pressed the button for the front door, put on shoes, looked around the apartment in the 10 seconds he had, which was not nearly enough kindness, to do anything about the laundry on the armchair, or the crayon marks on the baseboard near the kitchen, or the stack of Lily's art projects on the coffee table, or basically anything about the state of his life as represented by his living space. He opened the front door. The hallway of his building smelled, as it always did, like a combination of things that should not be combined. Boiled vegetables, damp carpet, the particular ghost of someone else's dinner. It was a hallway that communicated economic reality without ambiguity. Laura Clark was standing at the top of the stairs. She was taller than he'd expected. He'd only ever seen her in the company-wide town halls that played on the screens in the conference rooms, and then always did a thing to people's scale. In person, she was 5'9", maybe 5'10". The charcoal trench coat was impeccably cut, the kind of tailoring that didn't announce itself, but was immediately apparent to anyone who'd ever worn the other kind. A dark turtleneck underneath. Her hair was dark and pulled back at the nape of her neck, smooth and severe and precise. Not a single element was out of place. She was striking in the way that certain people are striking, not conventionally. Not in the way that calls attention to itself, but in the way that made you aware that you were looking, made you aware of the specific geometry of her face, the steadiness in her eyes. dark eyes. The kind that processed information quickly and returned very little of what they found. She was also, he noted, slightly damp from the rain. Just at the shoulders. She looked at him. He looked at her. Down the hall behind her, he could see a large man in a dark suit standing near the stairwell exit with his arms crossed and his face blank. Private security. You brought security, Ryan said. I always travel with security. That's okay. He stepped back from the doorway. Come in. She walked in. She walked through his front door and into his apartment, and she didn't react to it. That was the thing he noticed first. She didn't look around with the quick, involuntary assessment of someone registering a space that was very different from the spaces they usually occupied. She just walked in and stood in the middle of the main room and looked at him with that steady, data-processing gaze. And either she genuinely didn't care about the mismatched furniture and the unfolded laundry and the art projects and the crayon marks, or she was very, very good at not showing things. He suspected the latter. He suspected it was a skill she'd developed over time and used like a tool. Lily looked up from the rug. She looked at the tall woman in the charcoal coat who had just walked into the place where they lived. She held up a blue plastic block, the way she held things up when she wanted to assess whether someone was going to be interested in them. Hi, Lily said. Laura Clark looked down at her, and for a moment brief, maybe 2 seconds, gone almost before Ryan could register it, something moved across Laura Clark's face. Not quite an expression. More like the absence of the expression she normally wore. A gap in the surface of it, and underneath the gap was something Ryan couldn't name because it moved too fast and she closed it too quickly. Like a window opened and shut. Hello, Laura said. Her voice had dropped a register. Slightly softer. I'm Lily. I had a fever but my dad made it go away. I'm Laura. I'm glad you're feeling better. Ryan moved between them. Not aggressively. Just moved, the automatic positioning of a parent whose instinct is to place himself between his child and an unknown quantity. Lily, keep building. Daddy needs to talk to this lady for a minute. He gestured toward the kitchen. In here. Laura followed him to the kitchen. She sat in one of the chairs at the small table without being invited to and without examining the chair first. She set her hands on the table, one over the other, and the expensive watch on her left wrist caught the gray window light. She looked at him. He should offer her something. That was the social protocol. Do you want coffee? It's not great coffee, it's from yesterday and I microwaved it. I'm fine, Mr. Robinson. She waited. Sit down. He sat. The kitchen was quiet. From the living room came the small sounds of Lily and her blocks. Outside, rain against the window. A police siren somewhere below, rising and fading. Your email, Laura said, was unprofessional. I know. Hostile. Accusatory. It violated 4 separate internal communication protocols. It was sent at 3 o'clock in the morning, which tells me you wrote it in an emotional state, rather than a deliberate one. I know, Ryan said again. He put his forearms on the table. The initial shock of her presence was wearing off the way shock always did. And what it left behind was the same exhausted, bone-deep clarity that had gotten him through the last 18 hours. He was tired of being careful. He was tired of calculating how much truth was safe to say. You drove across the city to tell me my email had bad etiquette? No. Something shifted in her posture, almost imperceptible. I drove across the city because Donald Thomas was terminated yesterday morning. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. What? He violated 6 separate management conduct policies. 3 that deal directly with how managers interact with employees managing family medical situations. The documentation from the HR complaint, your email, was explicit enough that our internal audit team had grounds to act immediately. She held his gaze. They also spent 4 hours yesterday tracing the metadata on the Q2 predictive model and the Q3 projections back to their origin. Ryan didn't say anything. He took credit for your work for 18 months, Laura said. The metadata doesn't lie. The timestamps don't lie. The version histories don't lie. A beat. He was a parasite. He's gone. Ryan picked up his coffee mug. He didn't drink from it. He just held it, needing something to do with his hands, while his brain processed the information that the thing he'd assumed was invisible, the thing he'd assumed no one was ever going to see, because no one with the authority to act had any incentive to look, had been seen. "Okay," he said finally. "Donald is gone. Good." He set the mug down. "But it doesn't change anything for me. I don't have a job." I walked out. HR confirmed the voluntary resignation. "That's a closed loop. I want you to come back." No, she didn't react to the speed of it. "Hear the offer. I've heard enough offers from your company to know what they cost." He leaned forward. The exhaustion was real, but so was the anger underneath it. And the anger was the cleaner emotion, the one with more structural integrity. "Look around, Miss Clark." He gestured the kitchen, the apartment, the window, the general situation. "This is my life. Not as a concept, as an actual material reality. I don't have backup plans. I don't have a trust fund. I don't have a live-in nanny or a cleaning service or any of the infrastructure that makes working 60 hours a week possible for the people who build careers at companies like yours." She didn't move. "Your company," he continued, and his voice was steady. He was surprised by how steady it was. "Requires constant presence. It requires that I perform dedication by being visible. It requires that I pretend." He pointed toward the living room. "It requires that I pretend she doesn't exist from 9 to 5 or, in Donald's version, 9 to 8. It treats parenting as a liability. It treats anything that competes with the company's timeline as an attitude problem. And it covers all of that." He spread his hands. "With a ping-pong table and a kombucha tap and a very nice campus and a website that says we're a family." Laura was quiet for a moment. "You've been a single parent since she was 4. "Yes. Her mother. Cancer." He said the word the way he always said it. Flat. Deliberate. A stone placed down rather than thrown. 3 years ago, fast, she looked at the table. Not down in the way of someone avoiding eye contact. Down in the way of someone registering a weight. "I'm sorry. I don't need pity." The words came out harder than he intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. "I need a job that understands she is more important than a deck. Clark Data Systems is not that job. It was not that job on Monday. It was not that job when I got there 4 years ago. The culture you've built, the culture I'm aware needs to be rebuilt." He stopped. "That's why I'm here," Laura said. She shifted slightly in the chair, and something in her expression changed, not softened exactly, but realigned, like a lens adjusting for a different focal length. "I'm not offering your old job back. I am offering you a new position. One I created this morning. Director of Human Analytics." Ryan stared at her. "That's not a real department." "It is now. You invented it." "I invented it," she agreed, without any apparent embarrassment about this. "I want you to take everything you know about data, everything you used in that email, every cross-reference, every pattern you've been noticing for 4 years, and I want you to run it against my company. Every division, every manager, every policy that looks functional on paper and functions as a machine for destroying people in practice. I want you to find the rot." Ryan was quiet. "I have the analytical framework," she said. "I have the infrastructure. What I have apparently lacked, for longer than I'd like to admit, is someone willing to look at that infrastructure honestly." She paused. "Your email was the first honest internal communication I've received in 2 years. That's not a recommendation for your email etiquette. It's a statement about the problem." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "What about hours? Work from this table." She said it simply, without the slight hesitation of someone making a concession. "Work at 2 in the morning. Work while she's at school. Bring her to the office when you need to. I do not care about FaceTime, Mr. Robinson. I care about what the work produces." He looked at the living room. Lily had achieved some kind of structural breakthrough with her fortress. He could tell by the quality of the humming. Satisfied humming. Engineers humming. He looked back at Laura Clark. "You know my account balance," he said. "I do. You know my rent." "I do. How?" "I run a data aggregation company." Her voice didn't change, steady, factual, almost disinterested, the way you might state that water is wet. "I know everyone's numbers, Mr. Robinson. Everyone who has ever interacted with our systems or a system we touch. Don't pretend you didn't know that's how the world works. You've been sitting in the middle of that infrastructure for 4 years." Ryan stood up. "Get out." She looked at him. Then she stood too, smoothed the front of her coat with 2 practiced movements, reached into the deep outer pocket and came out with a business card. Matte black. Silver foil lettering. Substantial in the way that things are made to feel substantial when the person carrying them wants you to register their weight. She set it on the kitchen table. "I'm not offering a rescue, Mr. Robinson." Her voice was even. No heat in it. Just information delivered cleanly. "I'm offering a transaction. You have something my company needs. I have something yours does. If you want to talk about the terms like 2 adults who understand how markets work, call the number." She walked to the front door. He didn't follow. "Goodbye, Lily," she said, and her voice did the thing again, dropped a register, softened at the edges. From the living room without looking up from the fortress. "Bye, Laura." The door opened. The door closed. The lock engaged with a clean, precise click. Ryan stood in his kitchen for a moment. Then he walked to the table and looked at the business card. Laura Clark, founder and CEO, Clark Data Systems. A phone number. An email. He didn't pick it up. Would you treat them with kindness? He went to the living room and sat in the armchair and watched Lily build her fortress in the gray October light that came through the window, and he thought about 142 and 1,000. Would you treat them with kindness? 808 days, and a woman who had appeared in his hallway smelling like dry cleaning and speaking in the calm, level tones of someone who was used to the world reorganizing itself around her decisions. He thought about what she'd said about the rot, about finding it. He thought about 4 years of watching the model get attributed to the wrong person. 4 years of watching the numbers tell a story that nobody with the power to change anything seemed interested in reading. He thought about Donald Thomas's face in the aisle between the cubicles. Lily placed a purple triangle on top of the tower she'd been building, and it held. "Daddy," she said, still looking at the fortress. "Is the lady coming back?" "I don't know, kiddo." She seemed like she had a lot to think about. Ryan looked at his daughter, 7 years old. "Accurate." "Yeah," he said. She did. The business card sat on the kitchen table for 3 days. Ryan walked past it approximately 40 times. He put a book on top of it on the 2nd day, more to stop himself from looking at it than anything else, and then he moved the book on the 3rd day to look at it again, and then put the book back. He applied to 2 jobs online. He got 1 automated rejection and 1 silence. He looked at his banking app once per day, with the focused dread of someone checking a wound. On the 3rd night, Lily was asleep. The apartment was quiet. The street lamp was doing its thing with the linoleum. Ryan sat at the kitchen table. He moved the book. He looked at the card for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. He called her at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. Not because he'd made a decision. Because he'd been sitting at the kitchen table for 40 minutes staring at a business card and his banking app in alternating sequence, and his brain had finally done the math enough times that the answer stopped changing. 142. 1,800. 8 days. The numbers didn't care about his principles. The numbers just sat there, patient and absolute, the way numbers always did. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "Mr. Robinson." No surprise in her voice. Like she'd been expecting the call and had simply been waiting for him to get there. "I have conditions." A pause. Then, "I assumed you would. I work from home. Full stop. No mandatory office days, no minimum FaceTime requirements, no Slack messages after 7 p.m. Unless something is physically on fire. Acceptable. I set my own hours around Lily's schedule. I don't explain or justify those hours to anyone. Acceptable. I report directly to you, not through Gary Young, not through any other layer of management. If someone tries to insert themselves between me and you on this work, I walk." A slightly longer pause this time. Also acceptable. He hadn't expected all 3 to land that fast. He'd prepared arguments for each one. He'd had counterpoints ready, and now they were just gone. Accepted. Which left him standing in his kitchen feeling slightly like a man who'd braced for a door that opened inward. "Compensation," he said. 140,000. Plus benefits that begin on your first day, not after a 90-day waiting period. Ryan sat down on the stool. 140. That was 75% more than he'd been making. That was the difference between checking his banking app with the focused dread of someone reading a diagnosis and just not doing that. Just not living in that particular frequency of low-grade panic that had become so constant. He'd stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a refrigerator hum. "Why?" he said. "Because the work is worth that. You don't know what I'll find. I know what you already found in 4 years, without root access, and without anyone telling you to look." Something shifted in her voice. Not warmer exactly, more precise. The Q2 model alone saved this company $4 million in redundant infrastructure costs. Donald received the credit, the stock options, and the recognition. You received a corduroy jacket and a company thermos. A beat. I'm correcting the accounting. He looked at the business card on the table, the silver foil of her name catching the light. I'll need full access. Not just the executive dashboard. Everything. Badge data, insurance claims aggregates, Slack metadata, server commit logs. All of it. You'll have it Monday morning. And I want to talk to employees directly. Not surveys. Actual conversations. Off the record. No HR present. I'll make it happen. He exhaled, slow. The kind of exhale that releases more than air. Okay, good. Her voice returned to its normal register. Businesslike. Done with the personal portion of the evening. Get some sleep, Mr. Robinson. Monday is going to be a long day. She hung up. Ryan sat in the kitchen for another few minutes. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the way you feel when a very long period of sustained tension suddenly has somewhere to go, not relief exactly, but something structural. A beam finding its load-bearing position. He picked up the business card, turned it over, put it in his jacket pocket. Monday arrived the way Mondays do when you've been dreading and anticipating something simultaneously too fast and too slow at once. The week before compressed into nothing, and the morning itself stretched out in front of him like a hallway that kept extending. At 7:14 a.m., someone knocked on his door. Not the sharp triple knock of a week ago. This was a single heavy impact. The knock of someone with somewhere else to be and limited patience for the concept of waiting. Ryan opened the door, a courier. Mid-30s, gray jacket, an expression that communicated profound indifference to the nature of his deliveries. He held a Pelican case, hard shell, black, with a particular density of something that contained expensive things and a small electronic reader. Robinson? Yeah. Thumbprint. Ryan pressed his thumb to the reader. It beeped. The courier handed over the case, turned, and was gone down the hallway before Ryan had fully registered that the interaction was complete. He brought the case inside, set it on the kitchen table. The latches were biometric, a pad on the right side that registered his thumb again, with a soft green pulse, and the case opened with a sound like a very satisfied exhale. The laptop inside was not a work laptop. Ryan knew work laptops. He had used work laptops for 11 years. They were plastic, they were configured by IT. They had 17 security prompts before you got to the desktop, and a camera sticker applied by someone in compliance. This was not that. This was a machine that hummed when you opened it. The kind of hum that meant it was doing something, even when it appeared to be doing nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? The display was the quality of display that made you realize every other screen you'd ever looked at was lying to you slightly. Taped to the screen was a sticky note. Handwriting that was angular and efficient. The handwriting of someone who had learned to communicate in compressed, direct bursts. Your thumbprint is registered. Root access granted. Find the ROT. L.C. He pressed his thumb to the pad on the side of the machine. The screen came alive. No login prompt. No VPN tunnel. No security clearance waterfall. Just in. Directly and completely inside the nervous system of a company that managed data for a significant portion of the Eastern Seaboard's tech infrastructure. He had access to servers he hadn't known existed. Access to compartmentalized divisions that were invisible from the standard employee dashboard. Access to the aggregate anonymized insurance data that he'd suspected existed but had never been able to confirm. He sat down. Lily was at school. The apartment was quiet. He started pulling threads. The first 2 weeks were the most concentrated period of work Ryan had done since graduate school. When he'd written his thesis in 6 weeks, on bad coffee and the particular desperate energy of someone who had run out of time to do anything but the actual thing. He worked from the kitchen table. He worked from the couch with the laptop balanced on his knees. He worked at 11 p.m. after Lily was asleep, sitting in the yellow rectangle of the street lamp light, the apartment quiet around him, the data scrolling across the screen, in a way that told a story he was only beginning to fully understand. He didn't look at employee satisfaction surveys. Surveys were architecture for plausible deniability. They were the mechanism by which companies could point to documentation that suggested they had asked, while the design of the asking ensured they would never be told anything real. People lied on surveys, not maliciously, out of self-preservation, which was reasonable and human and completely predictable if you were designing a data collection system and didn't account for it. He looked at behavior. Behavior didn't lie because behavior wasn't trying to protect itself. Badge swipe data, timestamps of when employees entered and exited the building, cross-referenced against the Slack activity logs, who was sending messages at what hours, which channels, how frequently. The gap between badge out time and the end of Slack activity revealed something that Ryan started calling the ghost hours. People who had physically left the building but were still working, still responding, still performing availability because the culture demanded availability as a proof of commitment, rather than because the work required it. PTO data, days accrued against days actually taken. The number was damning in its simplicity. The average employee at Clark Data Systems accrued 18.4 days of paid time off per year and took 6.2. The gap wasn't because people didn't want vacations. The gap was because the culture had made taking vacations feel like a risk, like an announcement of insufficient dedication, like the kind of thing that got noticed by the wrong people for the wrong reasons. The prescription treat them with kindness. The prescription insurance aggregate was the one that kept him at the table longest. Anonymized by law, he couldn't see individual names or claims, but the aggregate trends were available to him through the benefits administration data, and what the trends showed was this. In the 2 months preceding each of Clark Data Systems' quarterly product launches, the claims volume for anti-anxiety medications, SSRIs, and amphetamine-class drugs increased by 42% compared to non-launch months. Not slightly, not marginally, 42%. Every quarter, for 3 years running. The company was making its people sick on a schedule. He found the pattern he'd been looking for by the end of the first week. Certain managers kept appearing in his data with a specific signature. Their teams delivered on time. Their metrics were consistently green. They were the people Gary Young cited in all-hands meetings as examples of operational excellence, and their employee turnover rates ran between 55% and 70% annually. They were burning people, systematically, deliberately or not, and Ryan suspected most of them genuinely didn't understand that fear was their primary management tool, because fear had always worked for them, and no one had ever shown them the cost of it. They were treating human beings as fuel, feeding them into the machine, running them until they broke, and then replacing them, and the machine kept going, and the metrics stayed green, and the stock options kept landing in the right accounts. But Ryan had the replacement cost data, $112,000 per senior developer, when you factored in recruiting fees, onboarding time, the productivity gap during the learning curve, and the institutional knowledge that walked out the door every time someone left. He built a model. He cross-referenced the efficiency bonuses the high turnover managers had received against the actual cost of their turnover rates. The math was not subtle. The managers who were being rewarded for efficiency were costing the company between 3 and 8 times the value of those rewards in replacement expenses alone. The HR algorithm was handing out stock options to the people who were bleeding the company dry. It was, Ryan noted in the document he was building, mathematically idiotic. He found something else in the second week, something he hadn't been looking for. Something that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about Clark Data Systems and the woman who ran it. He was cross-referencing performance data across divisions when he noticed a cluster that didn't fit the pattern. 7 engineers, distributed across 3 different technical teams but connected by a metadata thread that appeared when he looked at the right level of the server architecture. Their performance metrics were not just good. They were outstanding in a way that stood out statistically, even within the top quartile delivery speed, code quality scores, bug rates at launch, retention of knowledge base across quarters. They worked normal hours. Their Slack activity dropped almost completely after 6 p.m. They took their PTO. Their medical claims were unremarkable. They were, in the language of the data, thriving. He pulled the management structure data for those 7 engineers. The manager of record for all 7 was a name he hadn't expected to find in an org chart. Laura Clark, CEO, founder. The woman whose sticky note was still sitting on his kitchen counter. She was still managing a team, directly. Not symbolically, not ceremonially, but actually she was in their project channels. She was reviewing their commits. She was the one who had approved their last 4 sprint plans. None of this appeared in the public organizational structure. The board-level documentation showed her with the standard CEO direct reports, 4 C-suite executives and an executive assistant. The hidden team didn't exist, officially.
Ryan sat with this for a long time.
Would you treat them with kindness? Then he built a separate file and put everything he'd found about the 7 engineers and their undisclosed manager into it, and he left it open on the second monitor while he kept working. Because the shape of what kindness? Because shape was something he needed to think about from multiple angles before he decided what to do with it. The teacher planning day arrived on a Thursday in November, 3 weeks into his tenure as director of a department that had no employees, no office, no budget, and an org chart entry that currently showed as a placeholder rectangle, with his name in it. Lily appeared in the kitchen at 7:30 a.m. Wearing her purple star, shirt washed and defever since the last time, and her jeans with the rainbow patch and an expression of complete serenity about the fact that she had no school today, and therefore life was objectively good. "Am I coming to your work?" she asked, eating cereal with the focused attention of someone who had important decisions to make about milk ratios. "You're coming to my work. Is it a very real office? Do they have those spinning chairs?" "They have those spinning chairs." She considered this, took another spoonful. "Okay." The drive to Clark Data Systems headquarters took 22 minutes from their apartment, crossing the Allegheny and moving into the part of Pittsburgh where the architecture had opinions about itself. The campus occupied a full city block, curved glass, and exposed structural steel, and what an architect had apparently decided was a meaningful amount of living vegetation incorporated into the exterior walls. Panels in kindness, panels of installed moss that were probably supposed to communicate environmental consciousness, and actually communicated that someone had spent a lot of money on moss. Inside the atrium, the ceiling was 4 stories of open air. The floors were polished concrete. There was a coffee bar staffed by actual baristas and a climbing wall and a series of open collaboration spaces that were, at 9 a.m. on a Thursday, occupied by employees sitting in ergonomic chairs, staring at laptops with the particular expression of people who had been told they were working in a paradise, and were quietly noting the gap between the description and the experience. Lily looked up at the 4-story ceiling. "It's very tall," she said. "It is. Why is it so tall?" Ryan considered this. "So people feel like they're in a place where big things happen." "Does that work?" "Apparently not always." His badge matte black, like the business card, triggered something different at the security turnstiles. Not the standard green light, a red indicator that made the security guards on duty straighten up and then, when they looked at the accompanying clearance code on their screen, step back. He walked Lily through and signed her in on the visitor log, and they took the private elevator to the 14th floor. The executive floor sounded different. The carpet was thick enough that it absorbed footsteps, which meant the ambient sound level was close to silence, which meant you could hear yourself think, which also meant every conversation felt more exposed than on the open floors below. Heavy oak doors, assistants at sleek stations, all of them with the particular posture of people whose job required constant vigilance. Laura's assistant was young, late 20s, sharp cheekbones, a quality of controlled nervousness that suggested the job had been teaching him its own kind of acrobatics. He stood up as Ryan approached. "Mr. Robinson, Ms. Clark is in a meeting with the EVP. She's not. She told me to bring the kid," Ryan said, and kept walking. The boardroom doors were heavy. Dark wood, recessed handles, the kind of doors that communicated consequence by their weight alone. Ryan opened them and walked in with Lily's hand in his. The room was anchored by a table that had been cut from a single slab of reclaimed walnut 30 feet long, the wood grain running the length of it like a record of the tree's whole life, sealed and polished until it reflected the ceiling. The windows on the far wall ran floor to ceiling and overlooked the city in all directions. Pittsburgh below, the rivers glinting gray and silver in the November light, the bridges connecting the pieces of a city that had always been about crossing from one thing to another. At the far end of the table, Laura Clark. Beside her, standing, one hand extended toward a wall-mounted screens displaying an upward trending line graph, Gary Young. Gary Young was 58. The kind of 58 that announced itself, in the particular way a man carries 40 years of institutional power, back straight, jaw set, the comfortable certainty of someone who has been the smartest person in many rooms, and has stopped questioning whether that remains true. His suit was the kind that cost more than Ryan's monthly rent. His hair was gray at the temples in the way that gets called distinguished on men, and is simply called gray on everyone else. He was mid-sentence. If we mandate the return to office, we project a 12% increase in cross-departmental synergy by Q4. The data is clear that in-person collaboration drives. Laura held up one finger. Gary's jaw closed. She looked down the length of the table. "Ryan, you're late. I expected the preliminary audit by Tuesday." Ryan walked fully into the room. Lily came with him, taking in the ceiling, the windows, the walnut table, all of it with the thorough assessment of someone cataloging a new environment. I needed a larger sample on the server commit timestamps. The Tuesday number would have been incomplete. Gary's attention moved from Laura to Ryan and traveled through several emotional registers in rapid succession. Confusion first, who is this person? Why is he in my meeting? Then recognition, this is the analyst, the one from Donald's team, the one who walked out. Then the thing that came after recognition, which wasn't quite contempt, but was in the neighborhood of it. This is the analyst who walked off his team 2 months ago, Gary said, addressing Laura rather than Ryan. He shouldn't have clearance to be on this floor. Ryan is my director of human analytics, Laura said. She hadn't looked at Gary since Ryan walked in. She was watching Lily, who had drifted toward the glass wall on the near side of the room and was pressing her face against it, fogging the surface with her breath. "He outranks you on policy structure matters. We don't have a human analytics department." "We do now." Gary absorbed this. The process was visible jaw tightening, a recalibration happening somewhere behind his eyes. "Audrey, this is Laura." A very brief pause. "Laura, this is an active executive meeting, the presence of a..." He glanced at Lily. "This is not an appropriate environment." Ryan unzipped his worn backpack. He pulled out his laptop. He found the HDMI cable at the bottom of the bag, where it had been living with a dead pen and a receipt from the grocery store and a small plastic dinosaur that Lily had put there at some point and that he'd never removed. He plugged into the conference table port. The wall screen behind Gary flickered. The upward trending line graph, clean, optimistic, the visual language of a confident projection, was replaced by a scatter plot. Red dots, dozens of them, spread across the display in a pattern that looked less like a business chart and more like the aftermath of something that had exploded. Gary turned to look at it. His expression processed the visual. Then his expression processed what the visual meant. "This," Ryan said, "is your cross-departmental synergy data. Those red dots represent every instance of an employee badging into this building after 7 p.m. or logging onto the VPN on a weekend over the past 2 years." He let that sit for 3 seconds. Every single one of those dots is a person who stayed late or worked their day off Not because a project genuinely required it, but because the culture in this building has made visible overwork the primary proof of professional commitment. Gary crossed his arms. That demonstrates dedication. It demonstrates a management failure. Ryan pulled up the next slide. The bar chart of financial losses that he'd spent 2 evenings building. I ran 18 months of voluntary resignation exit interviews through a natural language processing analysis. Burnout, exhaustion, overwhelmed. Those 3 words or direct synonyms appear in 81% of exit interviews from your top-performing technical divisions. Not from your low performers. From the people you most needed to keep. Gary's color was shifting. The composed certainty was still there in his posture, but something underneath it was adjusting to new information it didn't want. Your return to office mandate, Ryan continued, which you've been framing as a 12% synergy projection. I ran the retention model against your top-tier engineering talent, specifically. The engineers who have the skills that your competitors are actively recruiting for. Within 6 months of a mandatory return policy, my model projects 30% of that cohort will leave for organizations offering location flexibility. He tapped the next key. The bar chart shifted to a projected cost analysis. The replacement cost for those engineers, factoring recruiting, onboarding, productivity gap, and institutional knowledge loss, runs to approximately $42 million. Your synergy projection doesn't cover the recruiter fees. Silence. It was the kind of silence that a room produces when a number lands that is too large and too specific to dismiss. Gary was looking at the chart. His jaw was set. The vein at the side of his neck was doing something that probably had cardiovascular implications. This is manipulated data, he said, and his voice was careful now. You're presenting a worst-case scenario as a projection and calling it analysis. I'm presenting a model built on your own company's historical turnover data from the past 3 years, cross-referenced against publicly available labor market research on remote work and engineer retention. You want to see the methodology? Gary's jaw moved. You're taking the side of employees who want to work from home and walk their dogs on company time. I'm taking the side of the balance sheet. Ryan said it quietly, without heat, which made it land harder than if he'd said it loud. You promote people based on the number of hours they are visible in this building, not on the problems they solve, not on the quality of the work they produce, on visibility. That's what your incentive structure actually rewards. And what that produces is a building full of people staring at their screens until 8 o'clock at night, not because the work requires it, but because they have correctly understood that being seen is what gets rewarded. That's expensive. It's expensive in salary hours. It's expensive in burnout costs. It's expensive in the quality of the work that gets done by people operating on 4 hours of sleep because they were performing dedication until midnight. And it is killing your company slowly enough that the quarterly numbers still look okay while the foundation erodes. In the corner of the boardroom, a sound, a small, satisfied squeak. Lily had found a dry erase marker on the rail of the glass wall. She was drawing, with focus, with commitment. A cat, recognizably a cat, despite having 4.5 legs and ears of different sizes taking shape on the pristine glass surface that normally displayed Clark Data Systems' quarterly revenue projections. Gary's attention snapped to her. The particular snap of a man whose last available target for his frustration had just presented itself. Get that child out of this room. His voice went tight. This is a Fortune 500 boardroom. Not a... Laura Clark stood up. The movement was not fast. It was very slow. Deliberate in the way that certain movements are deliberate when the person making them has decided something and wants the room to understand that the deciding is already done. She set both palms flat on the walnut table. She looked at Gary Young. My name is on the building, Gary. Her voice was even, low. The particular quietness of complete authority that doesn't need volume. Which means this boardroom is whatever I say it is. Gary opened his mouth. If she wants to draw a cat, Laura said. She draws a cat. She walked around the end of the table. Her heels on the polished concrete between the carpet sections made a sound that was very clear in the silence. She stopped next to Ryan. Looked at the scatter plot. Looked at the cost projection. Would you treat them with kindness? Cut the numbers with the focused, undefended attention of someone reading something they needed to understand, rather than something they needed to defeat. She was quiet for long enough that Gary shifted his weight. Then she said, so quietly it was almost not meant to be heard, you're right. Not to Gary. Not to the room. To Ryan. Specifically to Ryan. In the voice of someone who had just seen a thing they had been not seeing for a very long time. The rot is deeper than I thought. Gary left the boardroom 10 minutes later, after a further exchange that resolved nothing and established everything about the relative positions of the people in the room. Ryan began packing up his laptop. Lily was adding detail to the cat whiskers now, and what appeared to be a small hat. Laura stood at the window, Pittsburgh below her, gray and complicated and real. I need the full written audit by end of next week, she said without turning. You'll have it. A pause. The prescription data. The 42% increase before each launch. I want that in the executive summary. Not buried. It'll be the second paragraph. She turned then. Looked at Lily, who was now signing the cat in the lower right corner of the glass, a careful L, and then a careful R, which was Lily's standard approach to attribution. Something moved across Laura Clark's face. The same thing that had moved across it in the kitchen doorway that first morning. The gap in the surface. There, and gone. Make sure she keeps the marker, Laura said. Building management will deal with the glass. Ryan looked at her. You're allowed to be a person, you know, instead of a CEO. Occasionally. She looked back at him with an expression that suggested this was not new information, and also was not presently helpful. Then she walked out of the boardroom. The pushback began the following Tuesday, when the preliminary audit summary, 12 pages, 3 data visualizations, and a list of policy recommendations that Ryan had been deliberately conservative about, so he wasn't accused of overreach, hit the inboxes of Clark Data Systems' senior leadership team. By Thursday, it felt like a weather system, a pressure building from multiple directions. The head of the logistics division sent a 6-paragraph email to Laura that was carefully phrased but translated to, "This is going to destroy our operational capacity." The VP of Sales sent a shorter email that translated to, "My managers cannot function under these constraints." 2 directors in the infrastructure team requested urgent meetings with Gary Young, which Ryan knew about because he was monitoring Gary's calendar as part of the badge data cross-reference, and Gary had not thought to change that particular access setting. The core of the objection was always the same thing dressed in different vocabulary. We need our people in their seats. We need to be able to reach them. We need the hours. What the objection never said directly, but what Ryan could hear underneath it every time was, we don't know how to manage people without the mechanism of physical presence and permanent availability as controls. Take those away and we don't know what we have, which was exactly the problem. Ryan drafted the new policies from the kitchen table. Core working hours 10 to 3 5 days a week, during which synchronous communication was expected and reasonable. Outside those hours, no one was required to respond to anything that wasn't a genuine emergency, defined in writing as production system failure or equivalent. Unlimited PTO was abolished. Ryan had found in the data what he'd suspected unlimited meant the average employee felt too guilty to take any time at all, because unlimited time was time without structure, and time without structure was time that felt like it belonged to the company by default. He replaced it with mandatory 4 weeks of paid leave per year. Not optional. Mandatory. If an employee didn't take it by the end of Q4, their direct manager's quarterly bonus was docked by 10%. That last provision generated the loudest response. Performance metrics were entirely decoupled from time in seat and rewritten around objective, deliverable shipping code that worked, delivering analysis that was accurate, meeting the specific outputs that had been agreed upon at the beginning of each sprint. Not the hours, not the visibility, the actual thing. Ryan sent the final draft to Laura on a Sunday evening. She sent back 3 words. Go ahead. Send. The memo went company-wide on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, the executive floor had the atmosphere of a building that had just been told it was in an earthquake zone and was not sure whether to evacuate or wait. Gary Young walked the perimeter of the floor twice. Ryan knew this because Gary's badge data showed him badging through 3 different access points in a 90-minute window, with no corresponding meeting on his calendar. The forwarded email arrived at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. It came from an address Ryan didn't recognize, a Gmail account. Generic. The kind of address that told you nothing about the person who created it. The subject line was blank. The body contained a single attachment, a screenshot of what appeared to be a meeting summary from an external communication platform. Not a Clark data system. Something else. The screenshot showed a summary of a conversation between Gary Young and 2 names Ryan recognized from the board, both of them representing the private equity firm that held a significant minority stake. The summary was brief and specific. Gary was concerned about the new HR framework. Gary believed the framework represented a fundamental shift in operational philosophy that the board had not sanctioned. Gary was exploring whether the board had sufficient grounds to call a vote of no confidence in the current CEO's judgment. The argument Gary was building centered on Laura's decision to hire Ryan specifically to give roof-level system access to a person who had voluntarily resigned under combative circumstances and subsequently sent a hostile mass email to senior leadership. This decision, Gary's summary suggested, demonstrated a pattern of impulsive judgment that put the company at risk. Ryan read the screenshot twice. Then he called Laura. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she was awake, which meant she probably already knew. They're using me as the argument. He didn't say hello. Gary is telling the board that hiring me was a lapse in judgment. That's how they're building the no confidence case. A pause. Yes. Did you know? Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. Ryan looked at the street lamp light on the linoleum. Lily was asleep down the hall. The world was proceeding with its normal indifference to the professional machinations of the powerful. And you didn't tell me, he said. No. Why not? The pause this time was different. Not the pause of calculation. The pause of someone deciding how honest to be, because I needed to know if you'd stay when you found out. Ryan absorbed this. That's not your call. No, Laura said. It wasn't. A beat. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement, which from her was probably the same thing. Are you going to stay? He thought about 142. He thought about 4 years. He thought about the scatterplot of red dots, and what each one of those dots was a person, staying late not because anything required it, but because the culture had made them afraid not to. He thought about the 42% spike in anxiety medications on a quarterly schedule, as reliable as a weather pattern, as accepted as Pittsburgh rain. I found something in the audit data, he said. Before I answer that. All right, you're still managing a team. 7 engineers. Directly. It's not in the public org chart. Silence. They have the best retention numbers in the company, Ryan continued. Best performance metrics, lowest medical leave rate. 0 overtime, they take their PTO. He paused. You manage them the way you're asking the rest of the company to manage people. You've been doing it for how long? A very long pause. 4 years. So you've known for 4 years that this approach works. That it doesn't sacrifice performance for humanity. That you can have both. He kept his voice level. And you built a company that runs on the opposite principle. Yes. One word. Flat. She let it sit without qualification or explanation, which he was beginning to understand was her version of honesty. Why? Another pause. This one the longest yet. Because scaling a proof of concept and replacing a culture are 2 different problems. I knew how to do the first one. I didn't know how to do the second one without destroying the thing I was trying to fix. A beat. Until you sent me an email at 3 in the morning. Ryan stood in his kitchen for a moment. Lily's breathing faint down the hall. The refrigerator hum. Pittsburgh outside. I'm staying, he said. Good. But if you withhold relevant information from me again, I won't. You said that very fast. I mean it very directly, Laura said. And something in her voice had shifted, slightly, just barely enough to register the way a very controlled person sounds when they have just made a decision that costs them something. The board meeting is Thursday. The vote, if Gary can get the numbers, would come Friday. What's your actual exposure? Do they have the votes? They have 2 firm. They need 5 of 8 to call it. And the other 3? Persuadable, she said. In either direction. He thought about this. Then we need to be in that room Thursday. We will be. With the financial model. Bring whatever you need. A pause. Then with something that was almost dry but not quite, and Robinson? Don't bring the marker. Thursday morning had a different quality of light. Colder. The November sky over Pittsburgh doing its thing, pressing down gray and flat, the kind of sky that communicated the absence of options. Ryan dropped Lily at school. She had a project on weather systems, due, and had spent 40 minutes the previous night, creating what she described as a very accurate diagram of a cold front, which bore significant resemblance to a family of blue triangles having a meeting, and drove to the Clock Data Systems campus with his laptop and his worn backpack and the specific, contained calm of someone who had done the math and knew what the math said. Laura was already in the building. He knew this because her parking space, the one with her name on it, at the front of the executive lot, was occupied, and because her assistant messaged him at 7:48 a.m. Miss Clark is in her office. She says to come up when you're ready. He went up. Her office was at the corner of the 14th floor, 2 full walls of window, Pittsburgh in every direction. It was larger than his apartment. He noted this without particular emotion. It was just a fact about the difference between their situations, and facts didn't require emotional response. They required accommodation. She was at her desk when he came in, not looking at her screen but out the window, a coffee cup held in both hands. She looked different at 8 a.m. in a private space than she did in a boardroom or a hallway. Not less composed, just less performed. The armor was the same, but some of the surface calculation was offline. You find the anonymous email sender yet? He asked. She didn't turn from the window. No, I did. Now she turned. The send time correlates with an access event on the external comms platform from a device registered to the executive admin pool, Ryan said. Someone on this floor sent it. Someone who knew about the private equity meeting and wanted me to know. Laura set down her coffee. Her face was reading him. You have allies in this building, he said. More than Gary knows. She was quiet for a moment. Then, don't follow that thread today. We have enough variables. Fair. He set his backpack down. Walk me through what Gary is going to say. She did. She was precise about it. Clinical. The way she was clinical about most things that involved information. Gary's argument in 3 parts. The Robinson hire was impulsive. The new policies are destabilizing operations. The stock price dip of 2% last week is evidence of market concern. He would frame all of this as a loss of operational judgment at the CEO level. He would make it about Ryan as the symptom, and about the framework as the disease, and about Laura as the diagnosis. Ryan listened. He built the counter in his head. He'd been building it for 3 days. But hearing Gary's case out loud arranged the pieces differently, confirmed which data points were the load-bearing ones. I'm not going to defend you, Ryan said. Laura raised an eyebrow. In the room. They expect me to defend you. They expect the argument to be about your judgment versus Gary's judgment. About whether hiring me was smart. That's the frame Gary controls. He opened his laptop. I'm going to change the frame. She looked at him for a moment. The dark, data-processing eyes doing what they did. Show me, she said. He showed her. Would you treat them with kindness? By the time they walked into the boardroom for the special session, Ryan had added 3 more data points to the model and rebuilt the cost projection with a slightly more conservative multiplier, not because the original was wrong, but because kindness, conservative numbers in a room full of people looking for reasons to dismiss him were harder to dismiss. The 6 men and 2 women of the Clock Data Systems Board of Directors were already seated, neutral expressions all around, the careful blankness of people who have been in enough of these sessions to have learned not to show their positions early. Gary Young was at the far end, standing, ready. The particular readiness of someone who has prepared for a confrontation and arrived early to establish the room. Ryan sat down at the near end and opened his laptop. He was ready too. Would you treat them with kindness? The 8 members of the Clark Data Systems Board of Directors had the collective energy of people who had been told there was going to be an unpleasant conversation and had arrived early to make sure they got seats with good sightlines to the exits. 6 men, 2 women. All of them in the particular category of expensive that didn't announce itself but was immediately apparent in aggregate: the watches, the quality of the fabric, the haircuts that cost what Ryan's grocery budget used to be. They sat around the walnut table, with their legal pads and their water glasses, and their carefully neutral expressions, and they watched Gary Young's stand at the head of the table, with the focused attention of people who had been told this was important and were reserving judgment about whether that was true. Gary had prepared. That was evident. He had a presentation, actual slides, which told Ryan something about the severity with which Gary had taken this, because Gary was the kind of man who believed in the power of a well-formatted slide to make a mediocre argument look like a conclusion. The first slide was titled Operational Concerns, Q4 Assessment, Neutral Language, the vocabulary of a man who understood that the most dangerous accusations wore the most reasonable clothes. Ryan sat at the near end of the table, with his laptop open and his backpack on the floor beside his chair and his worn corduroy jacket, which he had refused to a kindness, with something that would have communicated a different set of things about him. He'd thought about it. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd stood in front of his closet for approximately 90 seconds on Wednesday night and looked at the jacket and thought about the boardroom and the board members and what they would see when they looked at him, and then he'd taken the jacket anyway. Would you treat them with kindness? Because performing a version of himself that was easier for powerful people to accept was exactly the thing he'd left Clark Data Systems once already over, and he wasn't prepared to start doing it through his wardrobe. Laura was at her end of the table. She had the gold pen in her hand. She was not writing anything. She was just holding it, turning it slowly between her fingers, a private rhythm that was either a habit or a calculated signal of composure. Probably both. Gary began. He was good at this. Ryan had expected him to be, and he was the controlled pace, the measured modulation, the practiced pause before key phrases to give them room to land. Gary walked the board through 3 months of operational disruption with the narrative skill of a man who had been telling stories to rooms like this one for decades. The Robinson hire, the route access, the policies, the 2% stock dip. He built it carefully, each piece placed like a brick, the structure rising toward an obvious conclusion that he was allowing the board to feel they were reaching independently. What we are witnessing, Gary said, his voice dropping to the register he used for things he wanted the room to feel were serious, is a pattern, not a single decision. A pattern of leadership choices that prioritize the unconventional over the operational. That privileged disruption for its own sake. He clicked to his next slide, which was titled Leadership Risk, Key Indicators. The question before this board is not whether we support innovation. We all support innovation. The question is whether this particular sequence of decisions reflects the judgment we require from the person who leads this company. One of the private equity board members, a compact man in his 60s named Arthur Bellamy, whose firm held 17% of Clark Data Systems voting shares, tapped his pen against his legal pad. Twice. Deliberate. It was. Ryan had learned from 2 days of reading board meeting minutes. His tell for general agreement. Tap. Tap. A woman near the center of the table, Meredith Walsh, independent board member, former CFO of 2 mid-cap tech companies, the person in the room whose opinion Ryan had assessed as the most persuadable in either direction, was looking at Gary's slide without expression, reading it the way accountants read things, for what was actually there rather than what it was trying to say. Gary finished. He set the clicker on the table. He looked at Laura with the composed, almost sympathetic expression of a man who had just done something he considered necessary and was prepared to be gracious about it. Laura looked back at him. Then she looked at Ryan. Ryan opened his laptop. He didn't stand. He stayed seated, which was a choice, because standing in would have been performing authority he didn't have in this room, and he wasn't interested in performances. He had something better than authority. He had a model. I'm not going to address the question, of whether hiring me was a good decision, he said. I'm going to address the question you actually care about, which is whether this company is going to be worth more or less in 5 years depending on what this board decides in the next 20 minutes. Meredith Walsh looked up from her legal pad. 2 scenarios, Ryan continued. He hit a key. His financial model replaced Gary's leadership risk slide on the wall display. It was not a beautiful presentation. It was a working document, columns of figures, clearly labeled, with the methodology note in a smaller font at the bottom of each page, because Ryan wanted anyone who questioned the numbers to be able to see exactly where the numbers came from. Scenario A. The board votes no confidence. Laura Clark exits. The new leadership team, whoever you bring in, inherits an organization in the middle of a structural transition with a core algorithm that was built by and is still actively developed by the departing CEO, with an engineering team whose top performers are already fielding calls from competitors who have been watching this company's talent for 2 years, and with a cultural reset in progress that has no clear owner. He let the numbers on the screen speak for the next portion. Cost projections. Timeline estimates. The orphaned algorithm problem laid out in 3 columns: development velocity lost, competitor acquisition timeline, projected market position erosion. Scenario A projects a 34% reduction in company valuation within 18 months, Ryan said. That's not a political number. That's what happens when you remove the person who is the institutional foundation of your core product, without a succession architecture in place. Which there isn't one, because no one built one, because no one planned for this. Arthur Bellamy had stopped tapping. Scenario B. The new HR framework is implemented fully over Q1. Engineering retention stabilizes based on the industry benchmarking data I've compiled from comparable companies that have implemented similar policies over the past 6 years. That data is on page 4 of the appendix. Product launch quality improves as a direct function of engineers working sustainable hours. Innovation velocity, which has been declining for 7 quarters, begins to recover. He clicked to the final page. The projected value line going the other direction. Scenario B projects a 19% valuation increase within the same 18-month window. Silence. Not the silence of a room that has been emptied of things to say. The silence of a room doing math. You're not voting on Laura Clark's judgment, Ryan said. Would you treat them with kindness? You're voting on whether you want to be right about a management disagreement, or whether you want to be 19% richer in 18 months. Those are genuinely different things, and I think everyone in this room is clear-eyed enough to know which one matters more to the people you represent. Gary Young's composure, which had been maintained through Ryan's entire presentation, with the discipline of a man who had trained himself not to react visibly to things that were hurting him, developed a crack, small, at the edge of his jaw, the muscle there doing something involuntary. This is a selective reading of incomplete data, Gary said, and the careful modulation was still mostly there, but the pace was slightly off now, slightly faster than it had been during his own presentation. You're projecting worst-case scenarios for one option and best-case scenarios for the other, and presenting the gap as though it's a fact. The methodology is on every page. Challenge any specific number. A pause. Gary didn't challenge a specific number. The market reacted to the instability your policies created, he said instead, moving to firmer ground. 2% in a week is a signal. The market reacted to 3 directors in logistics, resigning the same day the policy memo dropped, Ryan said. Those 3 directors had the highest combined employee turnover rates in the company. Losing them was not a destabilization event. It was a hemorrhage stopping. He looked at Meredith Walsh, because she was the one watching him most carefully and the one he most needed to reach. The stock price recovered to its pre-dip level by Friday close. That's in the appendix too. Page 7. Meredith Walsh looked at page 7 of the appendix. Then she looked up. Her expression had moved from neutral to something that was adjacent to convinced but not yet there, doing the last calculation. Gary looked around the table. He was looking for the thing that had been there on Tuesday, in the email chain, in the preliminary conversations, the shared sense of direction, the momentum. He was looking for it and finding something different. Finding people looking at their legal pads, or at the screen, or at Meredith Walsh to see what she was going to do, not at him. Laura stood up. She had let Ryan run for the entirety of his presentation, without moving, without speaking, with only the gold pen turning slowly in her fingers to indicate that she was anything other than a particularly well-dressed piece of furniture. Now she stood, and the room adjusted to it, the way rooms adjusted to her, not dramatically, not with any single person making a visible response, just a collective subtle shift in attention, the way a room full of people moves when the gravitational center of the space moves. She set the pen down on the table. "I had the data 3 years ago," she said. The room waited. Not all of it. Not the model Ryan built. But enough of it. Enough to know that the culture in this building was producing outcomes that were inconsistent with the values I said this company had. She looked at the table. Not down. At the wood of it. The long grain of the walnut. The history in it. I knew the prescription spike. I knew the turnover pattern. I knew what the exit interview language meant even before Ryan ran it through NLP analysis, because the same phrases appear in surveys going back 5 years. And I read those surveys. A pause, and I chose the quarterly numbers instead. Every quarter for 3 years, I chose the numbers over the people who were producing them. Gary's expression had become very still. Ryan Robinson walked out of this building on a Tuesday afternoon because his daughter was sick, and his manager told him that a spreadsheet mattered more than a 7-year-old with a fever. He sent me an email at 3 in the morning that was hostile and specific, and completely accurate about every structural failure in this company. She looked at Gary. "That email is the most honest internal communication I have received in 2 years. Not from any of you. Not from any executive on this floor. From an analyst who had been watching the machine eat people for 4 years and had finally run out of patience for pretending it wasn't." Arthur Bellamy's pen was very still on his legal pad. "You want to call a no-confidence vote on the judgment that hired him," Laura continued. "I understand the argument. It wasn't conventional. It was fast. It involved giving root access to someone who had been in the building 48 hours earlier with a different badge." She let that sit. What that decision actually involved was recognizing that the only way to diagnose a system is from inside it, and that the person best positioned to do that honestly was someone who had nothing left to lose by being honest. "Which is a condition," she added, and her voice was steady, "that very few people in this building have enjoyed." The room was very quiet. Laura looked around the table, each person. Unhurried. "Call the vote if you want to call it. I own 51% of voting shares. You cannot remove me without my participation in a restructure I am not going to agree to. What you can do is decide right now whether you want to work with what is being built here, which the numbers on that screen suggest is worth working with, or whether you want to spend the next 18 months in a legal and structural conflict that will produce the worst elements of scenario A, without even the satisfaction of having made a principled decision to get there." She picked up the gold pen. "I'll buy out any shareholder who wants to exit at fair market value. End of quarter. That offer is on the table for 60 days. Nothing moved. Not a legal pad. Not a pen. Not the careful, practiced faces of 8 Gin people who had been in many rooms like this one." Gary looked around the table. He looked for what he'd been looking for before. The alignment. The accumulated weight of shared position. And what he found, in the faces of the 6 other board members, who were not Arthur Bellamy in Meredith Walsh's expression of someone who had completed a calculation, would you treat them with kindness? In the 2 tech sector representatives who had been watching the policy framework with something that was beginning to look like interest. In the private equity partner who was not Arthur Bellamy, and who had spent the last 4 minutes looking at page 7 of Ryan's appendix, what Gary found was the specific, unmistakable quality of a room that has already decided and is waiting for the meeting to catch up. He looked at Arthur Bellamy. Arthur Bellamy was looking at his legal pad. Not at Gary. "This meeting," Laura said, "is adjourned." Gary Young did not leave dramatically. He did not stand up fast or knock his chair back or say something that would require a response. He stood up the way A man stands up when he understands that the structure he has been standing on has been quietly replaced with something that will not support him, and he needs to move before the difference becomes fully apparent to everyone watching. He gathered his materials. He nodded once at no one in particular. He walked out. The room breathed. Meredith Walsh was the first board member to speak, addressing Laura in the tone of someone who had made a decision and was ready to work from it. I'd like to review the methodology on the retention projections before the Q4 meeting. The page 4 benchmarking, I want to see the source data. Ryan will send it to you today, Laura said. Good. Meredith closed her legal pad. She looked at Ryan with an expression that was not warm exactly, but was respectful in the specific way that competence respects competence. The NLP analysis on exit interviews. Is that something we could apply prospectively? To stay interviews rather than exit? Ryan looked at her. He hadn't expected that. That's actually a better use of the tool. I thought it might be. She stood. Good meeting. She left. The other board members followed, in ones and twos, some of them stopping to exchange brief words with Laura. None of them addressing Gary's absence directly. All of them navigating the aftermath of a power shift the way experienced people navigate aftermath, by proceeding as though the new configuration had always been the obvious one. Arthur Bellamy was the last to go. He stopped at the door, turned back. He looked at Ryan with the expression of a man who had made a bet on the wrong number and was deciding how to file the experience. The 42 million figure, he said. That's conservative? Very, Ryan said. Bellamy looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once, clicked his pen, pocketed it, and walked out. The boardroom was empty except for Ryan and Laura, and the scatterplot still projected on the wall display, the red dots holding their positions, patient and factual, waiting to be addressed. Ryan closed his laptop. The room was very quiet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Pittsburgh was doing what it always did in late November gray, layered, the rivers dark below the bridges, the kind of sky that made the city look like a place that had survived a lot of things and expected to survive several more. That went well, Ryan said. Laura was looking at the walnut table, at a specific point near the center of it, where a small mark had been left on the surface, faint, barely there. The ghost of a blue dry erase line that building management had removed, but not entirely erased. The outline of a cat's ear. Gary is going to be difficult for the next 30 days, she said. He'll comply with the policies while he looks for another exit point. There will be a performance incident he tries to use. There will be a board communication that pushes the edge of appropriate. I know. Ryan zipped his backpack. I'm monitoring his badge pattern. He's been having a lot of off-campus meetings. I know. She looked up from the table. Don't follow every thread. Let him make the move he's going to make. It'll be cleaner that way. Ryan considered this. It was probably right. The cleanest resolution to Gary Young was the one where Gary Young resolved himself. And if he finds a thread to pull on, then we deal with it when he pulls it. Something shifted in her voice, the meeting mode falling away slightly, like a coat coming off after a long day. You changed the frame. That's what the data was for. You could have defended the policies on their merits. Most people would have. Most people would have lost. He looked at her. Gary controlled the frame. I needed a different one. She looked at him for a moment. The processing look, but something underneath it that was slightly different from the version he'd been reading for the past 3 weeks. Something that had come a little closer to the surface. The anonymous email, she said. You told me you'd identified the source. I told you not to follow it today. Today's over. Who sent it? Ryan picked up his backpack. Someone on the 14th floor who knew about the private equity meeting and wanted me to have the information. Someone who decided that letting me make the choice with complete information was more important than keeping the source clean. He looked at her steadily. I've narrowed the access event to 3 people. The timestamps, the device registration, the platform. 3 possibilities. She held his gaze. Her expression didn't change. I haven't looked at the final confirmation, he said. The last metadata layer that would tell me exactly which of the 3. Why not? Because if I look at it, and I'm right about which one it is, I have to decide what to do with that. And I'm not sure the knowing is more useful than the not knowing, professionally speaking. A pause. Would you treat them with kindness? Then with something that was almost the beginning of something that wasn't quite a smile, held in the same careful containment as everything else. Would you treat them with kindness? That's an unusually sophisticated approach to information management for a man who sent a 1,400-word hostile email at 3 a.m. I've grown. Apparently. She looked back at the walnut table, at the ghost of the cat's ear. Go get Lily from school. He looked at his watch. 2:48. He had 12 minutes. I need to send Meredith Walsh the source data. I'll have your assistant do it. I don't have an assistant. You will by Monday. She sat down in the chair at her end of the table, not the CEO's chair, which was at the head, but the one next to it, turned slightly away from the table facing the window. She didn't look like she was planning to leave anytime soon. She looked like a person who needed the room to be quiet for a while. Go. He went. The drive to Jefferson Elementary took longer than usual, a fender situation on the bridge. The kind that reduced 3 lanes to 1 and gave everyone time to reconsider their life choices. He arrived at 3:07. Lily was on the front steps with her backpack and her cold front diagram rolled up under one arm, talking treat them with kindness. Talking to another girl with braids, who was also waiting for pickup and who was listening to Lily's account of something with the focused attention of someone who had not yet learned that adult stories were often less interesting than they started. Lily saw his car and held up the diagram. He rolled down the window. How'd the cold front go over? Miss Patterson said it was very creative. Lily opened the back door and climbed in with her backpack and her diagram, and the general energy of a person who has survived the academic day and has opinions about it. I think creative means she's not sure if it's right. Creative usually means she liked it. She didn't say correct though. Were the triangles accurate? Lily considered this with genuine scientific rigor. Mostly. I made them a little bigger than real cold fronts for visual impact. That's called emphasis. Is that okay in science? In presentations, yes. In lab reports, less so. She processed this, settled it somewhere in the organizational system she was building for how the world worked. Dad. Did the thing at work go okay? He pulled into traffic. Yeah, kiddo. It went okay. The lady was going to be there? Laura. Yeah. Is she going to keep being your boss? Something like that. Lily looked out the window at Pittsburgh going by. The bridges. The rivers. The hills that the city climbed and spread across. She seems like she thinks a lot, Lily said. Like she's always doing math in her head. She is. You do that too. No. It's probably good that you work together, then, Lily said with the authority of someone who had just solved a problem and was ready to move on. Can we get soup for dinner? The kind with the noodles? The kind with the noodles, Ryan confirmed. Gary Young's resignation arrived by email on a Friday afternoon 11 days later, at 4:47 p.m. The Friday timing was deliberate. Ryan suspected the choice of a man who understood the optics of a quiet exit and wanted the weekend to absorb the news before the markets opened Monday. The subject line was Professional Transition Notice of Resignation. The body was 3 paragraphs of carefully assembled language that said nothing and committed to nothing and could be read, at a distance, as gracious. Ryan read it at the kitchen table. Lily was doing homework across from him, working through a page of long division, with the focused intensity of someone dismantling a puzzle one piece at a time. The apartment smelled like soup, the kind with the noodles, which he'd made from scratch this time rather than from a can, because he had time now. Actual time. Time that belonged to him past 3 p.m. He sent the email to Laura. No commentary. Just a forward. Her reply came back in 90 seconds. Good. I'll handle the board communication. Restructure announcement Monday. He typed back. Do you need anything from me for Monday? 3 seconds. No. Take the weekend. He closed his laptop. Homework done? He asked. 2 more. Lily didn't look up. Dad, if you have 47 divided by 6, what do you do with what's left over? That's your remainder. Write it as R5. Why 5? 6 times 7 is 42. 47 minus 42. She did the math on her fingers, her face cleared. Oh, yeah, she wrote it in. Neat and deliberate, the R5 sitting beside the 7 with the satisfaction of a completed thing. Why do they call it a remainder? Because it's what remains after you've done the even division. She thought about this. That's a good name. Math people are good at naming things. She looked up at him then, briefly, the way she looked at him sometimes, when she was deciding whether what he'd said was worth further investigation, or whether she had enough information to proceed. She apparently decided she had enough. She went back to the long division. Ryan sat in the kitchen with his closed laptop and his soup and his daughter doing homework and the November dark coming in at the windows. He thought about 47 divided by 6. He thought about what remained. 3 months passed. The kind of 3 months that are busy in the way that productive things are busy, full of specific tasks, with specific outcomes, the satisfying friction of work that was going somewhere. Ryan worked from the kitchen table in the mornings and from the Clark Data Systems campus on the 2 days a week he chose to go in. Not because anyone required it, but because some work was better in person and he was capable of making that determination himself. He had an assistant now, a young woman named Patricia Johnson, efficient and direct and possessed of an organizational intelligence that made Ryan's data work significantly easier, and an actual office on the 12th floor with a door that closed, which he mostly left open. The policies bedded in, not without friction. There were managers who complied on paper and communicated their resistance through the texture of their compliance, the specific passive quality of people doing exactly what they'd been told in a way that communicated their contempt for having been told it. Ryan identified them through them. The data, the ghost hours, were still there in those teams, just shifted, the slack activity creeping later and later as managers found ways to create urgency without technically violating the communication blackout. Would you treat them with kindness? He wrote 3 memos and had 2 direct conversations, and in one case recommended a performance management process that was uncomfortable for everyone involved and produced the correct outcome. The Q1 product launch shipped 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Bug rate at release, 40% lower than the previous 4 quarters average. No one burned an all-nighter to get it there. The engineering team lead sent Ryan a 2-line email the day after release. Best launch I've been part of in 7 years here. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Ryan printed it, put it in the folder on the corner of his desk labeled Evidence. Laura reviewed the Q1 results with the board at the March meeting. Ryan attended, sitting at the near end of the table in the same chair, in the same jacket. Meredith Walsh had questions about the methodology behind the stay interview, NLP analysis Ryan had developed based on her suggestion from November. The questions were good, specific, the questions of someone who had been thinking about the answer for 4 months. Arthur Bellamy asked about the projected timeline for the 19% valuation increase. We're tracking ahead of the model, Ryan said, not dramatically, but ahead. Bellamy tapped his pen once against his legal pad, then put the pen down. Good, he said, and did not elaborate, because Arthur Bellamy was a man who considered elaboration a luxury for people who weren't sure of their position. The board meeting ended. People gathered their things. Meredith Walsh stopped at Ryan's end of the table. The stay interview analysis, she said. I'd like to present it at the Q2 governance conference. Our firm sits on 4 other boards. I think there are applications. Ryan looked at her. You'd want to attribute it? Of course. She said it the way people say of course when the alternative is not something they've genuinely considered. Your methodology, your name, his name, on work he had built, attributed correctly. The thing that had been wrong for 18 months, corrected. Send me the conference details, he said. She nodded. Walked out. Ryan sat for a moment in the emptying boardroom. The walnut table, the windows, Pittsburgh outside, March now, the gray giving way slightly to something that had the beginning of spring in it, not spring yet. Just the idea of spring, the suggestion. The rivers below still dark but with a different quality of dark, less like December and more like the month before things change. He looked at the glass wall on the near side of the room. The cat was completely gone. Building management had handled it thoroughly, but Ryan knew, by the angle of the light at certain times of day, that there was still a faint mark, microscopic, barely there where the dry erase ink had been pressed into the surface. The ghost of a cat's ear, a small hat. He zipped his backpack. Laura was in the hallway when he came out. She was on her phone, not a call, reading something, her attention on the screen with that focused quality. She finished reading, put the phone in her coat pocket and looked at him. Q2 server load model, she said. You're off by 0.4%. I know. Getting sloppy, Robinson? Lily had a piano recital last week. I didn't open the laptop for 2 days. Something moved in Laura Clark's expression. The gap. The one he'd been catching at intervals since October. The brief opening in the surface. It was slightly larger now than it had been in November. Slightly larger than it had been in December. Not large. Still carefully managed. But larger. How was it? She said. The question came out differently than her other questions. Quieter. Without the efficiency of a question that exists to gather information and move on. She missed 3 notes, Ryan said. It was the most perfect thing I've ever heard. Laura looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the hallway. Then back at him. The 0.4%, she said. Fix it. Before Friday. I'll fix it. Thursday. Thursday is fine. She started walking toward her office. Then stopped. Half-turned, Robinson. He waited. The anonymous email. She said it without looking at him directly. Addressing a point slightly to his left, which was, for Laura Clark, practically an admission. The metadata. The final confirmation layer. I told you, I didn't look at it, I know. A pause, I sent it. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Would you treat them with kindness? The confirmation of what he had suspected, landing with the particular quality of a thing that doesn't surprise you and still changes something. I know. Now she looked at him directly. You knew. I narrowed it to 3 people. The access pattern. The device. The timing. He held her gaze. You were the only one of the 3 who would have understood why I needed to know before I could decide. She looked at him. The dark eyes doing what they did. Processing. I needed you to make the choice with complete information, she said. I know. And if you'd decided to leave, I would have had the right to. That was the point. He adjusted the strap of his backpack. You gave me the information because you thought I deserved to make a real choice. Not a choice based on incomplete information and financial pressure. A beat. That's the policy, isn't it? The one you're trying to build into this company. Treat people like they're capable of handling the truth. Something in her face shifted again, the gap wider for a second. Then steady. Yes, she said. That's the policy. Then it worked. He started walking toward the elevator. I'll have the 0.4 fixed to you Thursday morning. He was 3 steps away when she spoke again. My daughter's name was Claire, she said. He stopped. Didn't turn. Waited. She was 8. Laura's voice was level, careful. The voice of someone carrying something heavy with both hands. Not setting it down, just acknowledging the weight of it. 12 years ago. A car accident on the interstate outside of Columbus. November, there was ice. The hallway was very quiet. I built all of this after, she said. The company, the algorithm, every patent and every acquisition and every board meeting. I built it because it was the only thing I could find that was loud enough. A pause. To fill a house that got very quiet. Ryan stood, with his back to her in the hallway for a moment. He turned around. She was looking at him steadily. Not asking for anything. Not expecting a response that fixed anything. Just having said the true thing, and standing in the space after the true thing, which was its own kind of work. Lily wants to be a structural engineer, Ryan said. She's been telling me this for 6 months. I don't know if she'll stick with it. She also wanted to be a marine biologist in September, but right now she's very serious about it. She draws load-bearing diagrams on her school folders. Something happened to Laura Clark's face. Very slow. The kind of thing that takes a long time to move because it has been very still for a very long time. Not a smile exactly. Something that was the structural precondition for a smile. The place where a smile could eventually grow. She signs her work, Laura said. I noticed. She's been doing that since she was 5. Everything gets the LR in the corner. Good habit. That's what I told her. They stood in the hallway for a moment. The executive floor with kindness. The executive floor quiet around them, the thick carpet absorbing everything. the Pittsburgh March light coming through the far window at the end of the corridor and lying across the floor in a pale rectangle. Thursday, Laura said. Thursday, Ryan confirmed. He took the elevator down. 6 months after a Tuesday in October, when he had not planned to throw his career away, Ryan Robinson lived in a different apartment in a different neighborhood. Not a different city. Pittsburgh. Always Pittsburgh. But a neighborhood with old oak trees on the sidewalks and a school that had a music program and a park, 2 blocks over where Lily had already identified the best climbing tree, with the focused proprietary attention of someone staking a claim. The apartment had 3 bedrooms and a kitchen, with countertops that did not peel. This was the detail that Lily had most noted when they moved in. She had pressed both palms flat on the countertop and announced that it was very sturdy, and then immediately asked if she could use it for her volcano model, which Ryan had said yes to and now slightly regretted, given the scope of what a volcano model apparently required. It was a Tuesday evening in April, which was a coincidence that Ryan had noted and chosen not to assign meaning to, because he was a data analyst, and data analysts knew the difference between patterns and coincidences. The date didn't mean anything. What happened on dates was what meant things. What was happening on this Tuesday? Would you treat them with kindness? Lily was on the living room floor, with a set of magnetic construction tiles that she had received for her birthday, and had immediately deployed in the construction of what she described as a mixed-use residential and commercial development, with load-bearing considerations that she was still working out. She was narrating to herself. This was normal. The narration was the structural planning process externalized, which was something Ryan had read about in a child development article, and found he didn't need the article to have already understood. He was at the kitchen island. Laptop open. The data on his screen was different from the data that had been on his screen 6 months ago. The retention numbers had stabilized across 3 of the 5 engineering divisions. The Q4 prescription aggregate data, the most recent, covering the January product launch, showed a 16% increase in the 2 weeks prior to launch, down from 42. Still elevated. Still a signal. Still work to do. But the direction had changed. Direction's changing. That was the thing. Not arrival, not completion. The direction. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized. Would you treat them with kindness? No name saved. They had never had the kind of relationship where he saved her contact with a name that meant something, and she had never offered one. Would you treat them with kindness? And the number was sufficient because there was only one person who texted him on a Thursday night about server load models, and on a random Tuesday about nothing in particular. Q2 server load review. Your revised model. Strong work. He looked at the message. And then, at Lily, who had just placed a structural element with the careful precision of a person who understood what happened when you got a load-bearing decision wrong and was not prepared to find out again. He typed back. She played without the sheet music this time. Front row. Didn't miss a note. He set the phone on the counter. It buzzed again in 11 seconds. Which piece? He smiled at that. Picked the phone back up. Fur-Elise. She's been practicing for 3 months. 7 seconds. She'll get tired of it eventually. They always move on. He thought about this. Would you treat them? About the way children move from thing to thing, with a completeness that adults lost somewhere along the way, the ability to fully inhabit one interest and then fully inhabit the next one without grief for the previous one. About Claire. About what it meant that Laura Clark knew this about children. About the particular quality of knowledge that came from loss. He typed, she's already talking about a piece called Something I Can't Pronounce. French, with a lot of sharps. 18 seconds this time. Debussy, probably. Good taste. He put the phone face down on the counter. He closed the laptop. He sat for a moment in the kitchen. The new countertop solid under his forearms. The apartment warm. The April evening with kindness. Evening outside the window, a different quality of darkness than October. Less pressing, more like a thing that was temporary and knew it. Lily placed something on her structure, and it held. He could tell by the quality of the silence she produced, when something worked, the complete cessation of narration, the brief held breath of an engineer whose calculation has proven correct. He got up from the stool. He walked to the living room and sat down on the rug beside her. He picked up a tile. blue, rectangular. He held it and looked at the structure she had been building for 40 minutes, complex, multi-tiered, internally logical, in the way that Lily's constructions were always internally logical, even when they were also deeply idiosyncratic. Need structural support on the east wing? He asked. Lily looked at him with the evaluating expression of a project lead assessing an incoming collaborator. Yes, but you have to do it right. The dragons live on that side and they need load-bearing walls. What kind of load are the dragons putting on the structure? She considered this with genuine seriousness. They're medium-sized dragons, not the huge ones, so probably about, she thought, 4 tiles worth of dragon? 4 tiles. Okay, and they're stationary or moving. Mostly stationary. But sometimes they shift. Dynamic load, Ryan said. That changes the calculation. Lily's eyes went bright. This was a new concept being added to the structural engineering vocabulary she was building in real time, one Tuesday evening at a time. What does dynamic load mean? It means the weight isn't fixed. It changes, shifts. So you have to build for more than the average weight because you don't know exactly when the weight will move or how much. She absorbed this, looked at the east wing of her structure with new eyes, the eyes of someone recalculating. So I need more tiles than I thought. Probably. Okay. She handed him 3 blue tiles. You do those 2. I'll do this corner. He placed the first tile where she indicated. Careful. Level. Getting it right because she'd asked him to get it right, and because she would notice if he didn't, and because, frankly, the dragons deserved a structurally sound wall. Dad, Lily said, fitting her corner tile into position with a small, satisfied click. Yeah. Is Laura your friend? He thought about this, about the specific category of the question and what honest answer it had. Something like that. She texts you sometimes. She does. Does she have a kid? The question landed the way certain questions landed quietly, without warning, in the space between one breath and the next. He placed the second tile. Took a moment. She did, he said. She doesn't anymore. Lily processed this. She had the particular quality of a child who had grown up adjacent to loss, who had understood from a young age that the world contained holes where people used to be, and who treated this knowledge not with fear, but with a kind of careful, respectful attention. That's sad, she said simply. Yeah, maybe that's why she thinks so much. Ryan looked at his daughter, 8 years old, working on the corner of a dragon habitat on a Tuesday evening. Accurate, in the way she was often accurate without knowing she was being accurate. Maybe, he said. They built for a while in comfortable silence. The east wing took shape. The load-bearing walls went in at the angles Lily calculated. The structure held. Outside, Pittsburgh was doing what Pittsburgh did in April, the oak trees on the sidewalk putting out their first tentative leaves, the kind that would get knocked back by one more cold snap and then return more committed. The way things in Pittsburgh returned, having survived something and finding themselves still here. Ryan placed the last tile. It clicked into position, right where it belonged. The east wing solid, the walls, plumb. The dragons medium-sized, mostly stationary, occasionally shifting, adequately supported. Lily sat back on her heels and looked at it. Good, she said, with the authority of a structural engineer who has completed a review and found the work acceptable. Ryan sat on the rug next to his daughter and looked at what they'd built together and felt the thing that had no name in English, that compound, unglamorous, ordinary, irreplaceable thing, and let it be what it was. He didn't have to choose anymore. Not the way he'd had to choose on a Tuesday in October with 142 in his account and a 6-7-year-old and a spreadsheet waiting and a man blocking the aisle who had confused the authority to threaten people with the authority to actually matter. He'd made that choice. He'd made it without knowing it was going to lead here. He'd made it because it was the only choice he could live inside of and remain himself. Himself? That was the thing about the choices that cost you something. They were the only ones you could be sure of. Everything else was just math. He picked up another tile, held it out to Lily. What's this one for? She took it from him, examined it, placed it carefully at the base of the northwest tower, which had been looking structurally tentative for the past 10 minutes. Click. The tower held. Foundation, she said. Yeah, Ryan said, foundation. He stayed on the rug. The evening moved around them. Pittsburgh outside, the oak trees, the April dark coming in slow, and without urgency, the kind of dark that was just the day finishing rather than something to brace against. It was 3:15 on a Tuesday. He was exactly where he was supposed to be.